Welcome to the Southern Pulse Agronomy research site. Today we're going to have a look at some frost damage focusing on lentils. I'm Jason Brand, a Senior Research Agronomist with Agriculture Victoria, and with me today is Audrey Delahunty, who is a Research Agronomist and has done a lot of work with frost in lentils.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason said, I'm part of a research team that's been looking at frost in lentil for a number of years, and what we're finding is concurring with what growers are seeing most years is that frost is a huge problem, causing significant damage to both grain quality but also yield, which is translating to large economic losses across our pulses.
So what we're going to do today is go and have a look in the canopy of the lentils. So let's go and see what we can find. We saw a lot of this earlier in the season, and this is this vegetative frost damage. As you can see here, Ords, this really shows the vegetative frost damage, even though we have got a lot of damage on the pods as well, but this highlights the yellowing and the washout of the leaves that we get in here. So we see this quite common earlier in the season, and big differences between varieties.
Some particular varieties you may tend to see a lot more senescence across the crop compared to others which will look a lot greener and healthier following a vegetative frost. But the really important thing to remember with vegetative frost is because lentil and all pulses are an indeterminate crop, what we tend to see is that they have the ability to recover, so regrow some of that biomass and also start producing more green material, which is really, really important and a big advantage of pulse crops for frost.
And if we just turn over here, we've got one that has maintained completely green leaf throughout all the frost events this year. So let's just summarise the vegetative frost in lentils. What we first see is that yellowing or washout of the youngest leaves, probably about 2 to 7 days after the event, and then following that we'll get rapid regrowth.
We also tend to see differences in varieties in regards to their susceptibility to vegetative frost, and importantly what we also note is that vegetative frost doesn't tend to translate to losses in grain yield or quality effects of the grain at harvest. We're now going to focus on the effects frost has during the reproductive period. So what we're referring to now is the period between flowering to physiological maturity. But importantly, what we're going to look at is the effects of frost on flowers and podding, and importantly the grain filling period. Here we have 2 flowers that have died due to frost. As you can see, they're orange in colour and they look a little bit burnt and tend to be flatter in shape. This sign is typically observed from around 3 to 7 days following a frost event. Importantly, some research has indicated that frost during the flowering time doesn't necessarily incur a yield loss. In comparison, this is a healthy flower. As you see, it's white in colour and is in full bloom, which is a flower that's typical of what we'll see following a frost event when lentils reflower. Another thing to note is that a frost isn't just a frost. The intensity and duration will have an impact on your crop damage. For example, what we've seen is for a yield effect to be observed in lentil, we need at least 16 hours if a frost is around -2. So if you think about that, that's across a cumulative nights. So 16 hours around -2 at that when the lentils are flowering. But if you take a higher intensity, for example, -4, what we tend to see is that you don't need as long at that temperature, where we find that 8 hours around -4 will cause damage to your yield.
So the most critical component to look at in terms of reproductive frost damage in lentils is your pods. And so when we get back into the canopy just down here, we can look at straight away these flattened pods that are often turned brown. You can also go back a little bit earlier, so these are only just really tiny small pods that have gone dark brown. So that's probably the key symptoms that we're looking for in terms of frost damage on the pods of lentils. So what we have here is a flat pod that's been affected by frost, so you can see that webbing on the outside of the pod. If we open this pod up carefully, what we can see inside here is a couple of damaged seeds. And you can see how they've just turned black inside the pod. What we've got here is a pod that's slightly further developed. This is from an earlier frost in the season, and what you can see is the discoloration on the seed coat. So you can see the browning colour, which is the more normal colour, and then this whitening on the seed there, which indicates the frost damage, and that would be downgraded and growers would receive less. So sometimes in the early seed development phase, the seeds will still be a greenish colour, and we're unsure whether the frost has really affected them or not. And the best way to test that is actually just to give the seed a little squeeze, and often if they just pop, it means that they've already been affected by the frost. So they've been frozen during that frost event and they're breaking down. So in summary, we've got a couple of seeds here, one which has been severely frost damaged and compared to one that is still developing. And that seed coat will turn a nice brown as they mature. But obviously this one here is going to turn to nothing and it'll be blown out the back of a harvester at the end of the year. So we'll just move now from the frosted pods, which are a bit lower in the canopy, to some of the healthier pods, which are developed a bit later in the season. And as we open these ones up, we will see the healthy developing seeds. They'll be nice and green at this stage. So we've got 2 seeds developing in there, nice and green, unaffected by frost, and hopefully they'll stay that way until the end of the season.
In lentil, there are several factors that can influence the impact of frost. So this includes the landscape and topography, where the effects of frost, so damage, tends to be worse in lower lying areas because cold air moves to those and sits, increasing the time that part of the paddock is under cold temperature. Frost effects tend to be worse when the conditions are dry, so this can also correlate with soil types that hold less water. One of the other components that can increase your effect of frost is stubble/stubbles on the surface, but the important thing to note here is yes, there may be some anecdotal evidence to suggest this, but keeping your stubble standing is really important for harvestability and has many other agronomic benefits. And then one of the other key things that can coincide with frost, unfortunately, in our growing region is heat, which these 2 factors combined can increase your yield loss and also affect your grain quality. But I guess one of the good news stories about lentil is that they provide the recovery mechanism. If there's a rainfall event, there's the opportunity for them to reflower and build some yield through that following a frost event.
One of the things we've noted in lentils is when they develop a nice healthy canopy, the frost tends to sit on top of the canopy when we do get a frost event. So what we will see is most of the damage sitting on the side which is actually exposed to the frost. And then if we turn that canopy over, we can actually see the healthy pods underneath. So the big lesson from that is to have a really close look through your whole canopy, obviously focusing on that part of the canopy that is exposed when the frost event occurs, but certainly have a look right down throughout your whole canopy. So in summary, for reproductive frost, some of the things that we're going to look for. Firstly, starting at the flowers, we'll look for those browned or burnt off type flowers. Secondly, we'll look closely at our pods. So often you'll see flattened pods, they'll have a white webbing on the outside. And then closely look at the seeds on the inside. So as the pods are developing, open them up, have a look at the seeds. Smaller seeds will often go black, and the more developed seeds will have a discoloration, which is obviously going to affect grain quality at the end of the year.